Good evening. Welcome to the Macomb Center for Performing Arts at Macomb Community College. I'm Jim Sawyer. I'm the president here at the college. We're very, very excited to have you here tonight to help us kick off the James Jacobs Civic Engagement Project. This project was created to bring national recognized experts to Macomb County to facilitate dialogue on issues vital to our community and our region. It's the vision and legacy of the college's immediate past president, Jim Jacobs, whose 50-year career here at Macomb culminated in leading the institution from 2008 to 2017. Please join me in acknowledging Jim and his continuing contributions to the college's mission of education, enrichment, and economic development. Jim, can we have the... There we go. I'd also like to recognize the organizations that have provided funding to make the Civic Engagement Project possible. The Community Foundation for Southeast Michigan, J.P. Morgan Chase, and the Kresge Foundation. We appreciate their generous support in creating a unique and meaningful education and enrichment experience for our students and for our community. This afternoon, a group of Macomb students had an opportunity to participate in an interactive session with the two presenters. The conversations covered a variety of topics, including tariffs, tax cuts, monopolies, technology, education, and the nation's infrastructure. Dr. Summers reminded students of the importance of doing a good job wherever you're at, and that will lead to opportunities. He also suggested students find people they like, trust, and respect to work with, find people they admire to be their boss, and to be involved in training and mentoring those that follow them. This was an amazing chance for our students to connect with people that are leaders in the world, really. World leaders that provide a variety of perspective on what's going on in today's society. This not only heightens the potency of their education, but it also contributes to greater awareness and depth as they shape their own roles in their community. Without further delay, I have the pleasure of introducing you to our two speakers who will lead what I'm sure will be an enlightening discussion on economic globalism versus nationalism and its effect on Macomb County. Lawrence Summers is one of America's leading economists. He is currently the Charles W. Eliot University Professor and President Emeritus of Harvard University. Dr. Summers served as the 71st Secretary of the U.S. Department of Treasury under President Clinton and was Director of the White House National Economic Council in the Obama administration and served as President of Harvard University from 2001 to 2006. Joining Dr. Summers is David Wessel, Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institute, where he also serves as the Director of the Institute's Hutchins Center on Fiscal and Monetary Policy. Prior to this, he spent 30 years on the staff of the Wall Street Journal, most recently as economics editor. Gentlemen, we look forward to your presentation tonight.
It was worth the investment.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Good to be with you. Well, thank you very much. I gather from the applause there must be people there, because when Larry and I look out, it's just like total blackness. So I appreciate, we need constant oral feedback, if you don't mind. It's really a pleasure to be at Macomb College again. I met Jim Jacobs 20 years ago. I went with Jim and a delegation of Macomb County economic development people to Germany, where the idea was that Macomb was going to sell itself to Daimler Chrysler as the premier supplier of training. Well, let's just say that Jim's tenure as president of Macomb Community College lasted longer than the Daimler Chrysler marriage, and I think has proven to be more successful. So I'm particularly glad to be here to honor Jim and his 9 years of service as president and the however many decades he was here before that. And I'm sure Larry feels the same way.
I am glad to be here at Macomb and to celebrate Jim's many accomplishments, and through celebrating Jim's many accomplishments, celebrate an institution and the kind of institution that is central to America's future. If America's community colleges work to prepare our young people for careers of success, and they succeed in doing that, America will succeed. And if they don't, it's hard to see how America will succeed. The number of young Americans who are affected by community colleges is 50 or 100 times the number of young Americans who are affected by institutions like Harvard, where I teach. So I think what happens here and in places like this is really central to America's future. And that's why I'm so glad to have had the chance to spend this day here at Macomb.
So Larry, I think something that's on the minds of many people here, and I can see it in some of the questions I was given, is that people in Macomb County and elsewhere in America have this sense that somehow trade has been unfair, that we have been disadvantaged by governments that don't play by the rules, and that trade and imports have contributed to the winnowing out of the middle class, have held down wages, and in some cases led to people losing their jobs. This was obviously one of the planks of the Donald Trump's campaign, maybe the only thing on which he's been consistent. And he's responded by imposing a new set of tariffs. Do you think this is a good answer to the anxieties that Americans have about globalization and trade?
Well, I want to separate two things in answering your question, David. One is President Trump's steel tariffs, which I think, for reasons I'll explain in just a second, are almost entirely ill-conceived. And the other is the concerns about globalization, which I think have a lot of validity, but I think in the way they're often expressed are sometimes misplaced and therefore lead in directions for policy that aren't helpful. So let's start with the steel tariffs. There are three problems with President Trump's steel tariffs. The first is that 40 times as many people work in industries that use steel as work producing steel. So when you put tariffs on, you raise the price of steel and therefore make the United States less competitive in the industries where 6 million people work, and you're doing that to protect industries where less than 150,000 people work. And so you're in a sense shooting yourself in the foot in terms of American competitiveness. Then it gets worse because we're not playing football against a dummy defense. We're engaged in actual competition and interaction with actual other nations. And if we put tariffs on them, they'll put tariffs on us, and that'll further limit our ability to export. And so whatever you think about the merits or demerits of globalization as an abstraction, these tariffs will reduce the number of jobs, not increase the number of jobs. Now, we say we're doing this for national security, but only 3.5% of our steel is used for the national defense effort. 70% of our steel is produced domestically, and much of the rest is produced in those two well-known adversaries, Mexico and Canada. And so the idea that this is somehow going to protect our defense that needs protecting is, I think, absurd. And there's a third problem, and it goes to something that's pretty fundamental. And that is that for 70 years since the end of the Second World War, there have been huge struggles and terrible things that have happened. But fundamentally, the world has been at peace. Tens of millions of people died stopping Hitler. Tens of millions of people died in the First World War. The Cold War was won without anything like that toll. And that's a tribute to the kind of system that the United States set up. A system based on nations cooperating with each other even as they competed, nations that disagreed, that had difficult problems, but worked them through with institutions. And that system was underwritten by the United States, and it won the Cold War, and it created, even with all the problems, the greatest, largest middle class there's ever been, the one that we have in the United States. And if the United States says, forget rules, forget institutions, if we want to, we're just going to slap people around with tariffs, then how can it ask anybody else to live by rules either? And if that happens, we'll get back to the kind of competition and struggle for short-sighted individual advantage that we had in the first half of this century that saw the Depression and 2 world wars. So the principles behind this policy are, David, I think are not right. Now, that is not to say that the United States doesn't have, and that many Americans don't have, valid concerns. Nations that were once very poor and of whom not much could be asked have now prospered and succeeded in the world that we created, and we have to hold them to different standards than we did before. And so we do need to manage globalization better than we have managed it in the past. But here's the thing that most people don't appreciate. The real issue isn't trade agreements. It's that other countries have succeeded economically. If you look at any US trade agreement, it was a good deal, and it was a good deal in a very specific sense. The other nations reduced their trade barriers 2 or 3 or 5 times as much as the United States reduced its trade barriers. There's a reason for that. For good or for ill, right or wrong, the United States had gotten rid of most of its trade barriers by 1980. So what these deals were about was basically saying we're going to keep doing what we're doing already, and then getting other countries to reduce their trade barriers so we could sell more to them. And I think that's basically a good deal and in our interest. So what's the problem? The problem is that emerging markets have emerged, that they've gotten more competitive and more productive, and because they've gotten more competitive and more productive, they compete harder with us in some industries than they used to be able to. What can our strategy be? We could try to have a strategy of holding them down, not letting them be more productive, but in a very open world, we're gonna have a lot of trouble doing that, and if we try, we're gonna generate enormous resentment. The other way to respond is, I think the American way, is to stay ahead, to make sure that we're out innovating, developing better products, having the most skilled workforce in the world, with the best entrepreneurs, having the best infrastructure in the world to support our production so that we can win. And that's been our failing. Not that we're prepared to accept products from other countries. If we tried to wall those countries off, we would be caught up in all kinds of conflict. So yes, David, I think that globalization does pose a big challenge, but the challenge is for us to lead and win and take responsibility for our own destiny as a people together, rather than to try to lash out and resent people from other countries where we're not going to succeed.
Well, let's take the case of China. Do you think they play fair? Do you think they're taking advantage of us, stealing the intellectual property of our companies? And if so, what's our leverage to do something about that?
I think there's some Chinese companies that have taken advantage of some American companies. I think there are some Chinese business practices that ought to be resisted. And what's our leverage? Our leverage is a global system we created, the World Trade Organization, where when China is in the wrong, we can collaborate with all the other countries in the world and win the right to retaliate against Chinese production in a way that hurts. But if we engage in our own vigilante justice, I don't think we're going to succeed in getting China to change, because then the rest of the world's going to be on China's side, not our side. And I don't think if we do it that way that we're ultimately going to succeed in upholding the interests of American firms. And by the way, there's this sense that we're just losing completely and that nothing we do works. 6 years ago, China was exporting far more than it was importing, and China had a trade surplus, basically the difference between the amount it exported and it imported, that was equal to 8% of its total income, and it was one of the biggest ones in the world. And today, that trade surplus has fallen by more than 75%. So it's not that working collectively with other countries, we have failed to accomplish anything. We have caused China, we were very worried, and rightly worried, about China keeping its currency too low so that Chinese exports to the United States were cheap. We've pressured the Chinese, and they've spent $1 trillion, trying to make their currency be higher. But I think the right way to approach this is globally and with very clear and focused objectives in mind. And the kind of vigilante approach that we're taking, I think, will alienate many more people than it will inspire, and I think it will ultimately backfire. And by the way, that's not just some theory in my head. When it looked like we were in the heat of this at the end of last week, we had, as measured by the stock market, destroyed between $2 and $3 trillion of wealth. When it looked like we were going to pull out of this dive and negotiate something today, the judgment about the future value of the American economy is reflected in the stock market, and what it said about the fortunes of our major companies went back up.
So you make a point that our problems are largely domestic and our solutions are largely domestic. So what in communities like this one, employment has come back substantially from the worst of the Great Recession, but wages haven't risen very much. The median income of American households hasn't, adjusted for inflation, hasn't risen very much for a couple decades. What are these policies? What are the answers what would you do to increase the chances that the living standards of the average American will climb more rapidly than they have been? You can have up to three policies.
First, next thing you know, you're going to say 3 seconds to answer.
No. Larry usually says, I think of three things. And I know Larry very well, and he'll have one and two in his mind, but the third one will be brilliant, but he won't have any clue what it is until he gets to the middle of the second one. It's very impressive. I recommend it.
First, we can borrow money for 30 years at 3% in a currency that we print ourselves. And we've got an air traffic control system that's based on vacuum tubes, roads that are filled with potholes, bridges that collapse, and children in this state having their IQs reduced by drinking water with lead in it. There is every reason to put Americans back to work creating the best infrastructure in the world. That will raise the demand for labor, which will raise wages. That will improve the productivity of the economy, which will further raise wages. And by expanding the capacity of the economy, it'll ultimately enable us to pay back the debt. It is nothing short of crazy that we have the lowest rate of net infrastructure investment that we've had any time since the Second World War. Second, we have got to prepare people to win in the 21st century economy. That means very different skills. That means very different approaches to work than we've had traditionally. Why should it be that there are 25 other countries whose 14-year-olds do better on tests than the United States? Why shouldn't we have a better system than Germany, not a worse system than Germany, for moving kids who are 16 and 17 through training programs into sophisticated technical jobs that aren't the kind of work that comes from a 4-year liberal arts degree? We've had a stupid debate about education in this country for too long, where some people say we need more accountability and other people say we need more resources. I'm here to tell you that we need both. And I'm here to tell you that as long as we pay teachers in the United States below our too low median income, we're not going to have the kind of instruction for our kids that they're entitled to. So the second thing we need to do is to strengthen that educational system. And the third thing we need to do is build on what is strong and great about the United States, which is our capacity to innovate and to assimilate. We have a capacity for entrepreneurship and for cutting-edge science that is unmatched around the world. We are on the brink of cures for cancer, cures for Alzheimer's, not the brink like next year, but the brink like the next 15 years. Why should we be slashing the kind of support that we provide for those things when, once they're found, there are going to be huge opportunities putting those cures to work to extend the lives of millions of people? And look, a community like this ought to appreciate And yes, there are problems, and yes, there are things that need to be managed. But I just came back from China. I spoke with a man I had known for 20 years, since we negotiated back and forth during my time at Treasury in the 1990s. And he said, I just don't understand things some people are saying in the United States. People like, and he mentioned Henry Kissinger. He mentioned the guy who founded Intel. People came to the United States when they were 15 years old, and they made huge contributions to your country. That couldn't happen in China, he said. That couldn't happen in Japan. That couldn't happen in most of Europe. But it can happen in your country, and it's been happening for a century, and it's part of why you're so great. And why are you making your central policy be stopping that? And I didn't have any answer for him. And of course we ought to regulate, and of course we need to keep our borders secure. But God, the United States is the only country in the world that people from virtually every other country are prepared to risk their lives to come to. And we want to throw all that away? I just don't understand. So if we innovate and assimilate, if we strengthen and have the best education system in the world, and we have the best infrastructure, I do not for a moment doubt that if their government gives them the tools, that the American people can compete and win for the highest standard of living in the world against people in every other country. And that's real patriotism, not blaming our problems on something that's happening in Beijing or Tokyo.
So you point. On one hand, you identify a number of strengths that the United States has and a reason to be optimistic about our ability to build on those strengths to succeed in a global economy where we have increasing amounts of competition. On the other hand, our political system seems, at the moment, particularly unable to deal with almost all the things that you listed we ought to do. And in some cases, as you just pointed out, seems to be going in a direction different than the one that you and I would choose. So when you think about the next 5 to 10 years, which one of these two things dominates? The optimism about our fundamental strengths or the despair about the dysfunction of our political system?
No one can know for sure. And certainly I don't. And I don't yield to anyone in this room in my disappointment about the result of the last presidential election, and frankly, my concern about many aspects of what's happening in Washington. But I guess, and I could turn out to be wrong in this, but I guess I am ultimately an optimist. Winston Churchill said about the United States, America always does the right thing, but only after exhausting all the alternatives. And we're working through that process right now. But this isn't the first time that Americans have been concerned about their future. I'm old enough to remember when everybody thought there was a malaise and an American president, Jimmy Carter, declared a crisis of the national spirit. I remember when it was joked everywhere that the Cold War had ended and Japan had won. Look at how we've done over the last generation and look at how they've done. I remember, very barely because I was very young, the sense of panic in the United States after Sputnik and the sense that Russia would surpass us. I don't remember, but I've read about how Patrick Henry said in 1792 that the spirit of the American Revolution had already been lost. And I believe that it is precisely the strength of the United States that it has this capacity for self-denying prophecy, that it has this capacity for when things go off track, people to become very alarmed, to work together, to collaborate together, to mobilize together, and ultimately to get things back on track. How can you bet against a country that had 600,000 people, 600,000 young people marching in cities across the country last weekend? To stop craziness with respect to the availability of assault weapons. How can you bet against a country that after far too much time in ways that surely won't be perfect, has recognized that it is high time that everyone in the workplace be recognized and treated with appropriate dignity and valued and regarded for their contribution to our economy and to their institution or company. Yes, they're terrible things that have gone off track. Yes, in important ways, our political system has been too focused on the interest of a global elite and not focused enough on the people who live in the Great Lakes heartland of America. Yes, but you see the forces mobilizing that are going to change that. And so the question is whether we have faith in ourselves, faith in what our country can do as we Americans working together to win and to lead, or whether we're going to divide into a large number of groups, blaming each other and pointing fingers at foreigners. And I look at the young people here that I met with this afternoon. I look at the young people I'm privileged to teach at Harvard. I study the history of the United States, and I don't think we're going to let that happen. And so, yes, I worry a lot about the political system, David, but it's precisely because I think so many other people are worried that I believe it will get better.
One of the things that we've noticed over the last couple of decades is the gap between winners and losers in the economy has widened. And it's not something that started with in the 80s. It did start at the beginning of the 80s, but it's been persistent through different administrations, different tax bills, ups and downs of the economy. Why is it that the gap between winners and losers is widening? Why is inequality seem to be inexorably getting worse? And is there anything we could do to restrain that, if that's what the market, technology and globalization and social mores are producing?
Look, I think some of it does have to do with globalization. I mean, take a simple comparison of the world of today and the world I entered when I left graduate school in the 1970s. For someone who's fortunate, I suppose I'm an example, there's now a worldwide market for what economists do in a way that there wasn't at all 40 years ago. And so if you have the skills of an economist, there are more rewards to get. If you, Barbara Streisand, there's a market for you to do concerts and sell recordings all over the world. There wasn't anything like that in 1979. So that success of the rest of the world that I was talking about before benefits some people in our country, and it hurts others who find themselves in a competition they weren't in before with workers in poorer countries where wages are lower. And that's just what happens when the rest of the world succeeds. That's one part of it. Another part of it is that there's more ability for people with a great idea to get all the benefits of it. You know, the example I like to give is to contrast two great ideas. George Eastman invented the low-cost camera. And because he invented it, he got very rich. And because a lot of people had to produce it, the city of Rochester, New York, had a strong, thriving middle class for 60 years. Steve Jobs had a fantastic set of ideas, the iPod and the iPad and the smart and the iPhone. And when he had those ideas, a big supply chain all over the world got created and a lot of people worked, but there was no large community in America that developed a thriving middle class, and he got even richer than George Eastman had. And so those are the kind of phenomena that I think lead to increased inequality. What can we do about it? I think there are a few things. To start with, we can have a tax system that makes it better rather than makes it worse. We can have a tax system that's more progressive, not a tax system that is less progressive. And I believe President Trump and the Congress made a very fundamental mistake. There are lots of details you can talk about in the tax bill, the deficits and so forth. But I think they made a very fundamental mistake, and it was a philosophical mistake. There are a lot of different countries, and they all have corporate taxes. And the United States could have done one of two things. It could either say there's going to be a race towards zero as everybody tries to attract business. And our strategy is to win the race. And yes, that means cutting corporate taxes. And yes, if we cut corporate taxes, we have to raise taxes on regular people. But God, we've got to win the race. And we cut corporate taxes a lot to try to win the race. And the next thing that's going to happen is other countries are going to cut them too. And then we're going to say we need to cut them again. And pretty soon, corporate profits on planet Earth won't be taxed. That's the approach we took. There's a different approach. The different approach is to say that countries everywhere need to work together to say to major companies, you can produce, you can globalize, you can sell, But you can't hide your profits. They're going to be taxed on a global basis, with the proceeds going to people in all countries. And if we did that, those corporations and the people who own them would be paying taxes, and that would be enabling most of the people in this room to be paying less in taxes, and that would make our society more equal. Second thing we could do is we could finance our political system in ways that didn't reward those who had already been rewarded. You know, I worked on the so-called Dodd-Frank legislation. That was the legislation after the financial crisis that put a variety of new regulations and restrictions on banks to try to avoid another financial crisis. For every member of Congress, 435 members of the House, 100 people in the Senate, for every member of Congress, there were 5 registered lobbyists working to make sure those regulations didn't interfere with bank profits. That's not how it should have been. We can figure out how to take the money out of politics. And the third thing we can do that's actually really important in this, and it's what I already talked about, and it's probably what ultimately is, over the long run, most important, is we can make that education system better, and better for everybody, not just for the kids of the fortunate. Because ultimately, how much you earn is going to have something to do with how productive you are. And how productive you are is going to have something to do with how well trained, educated, and prepared you are. But if we have the right tax system, if we have the broad range of public policies, whether it's family leave or right to organize or regulation of monopolies, whatever it is, set in the basis of national interest, not moneyed interest. And if we have an education system that gives everyone's kids the opportunities that presidents and senators' kids have, we can have not just a richer economy, but a fairer one and a more opportunity-based one as well. And that's how I think we ought to respond to the challenge of inequality. But look, I think there's a different view, and I came in the direction of it, but I didn't go all the way there. And I think it's a dangerous view, and it's a view that exists in some parts of my political party. And that is that we need to tear down the successful in order to make things more successful. So I always ask my friends this question. If the United States had 50 more people like Bill Gates, would it be better or would it be worse? You can say it'd be worse. There'd be all these people with a lot of wealth, there'd be more wealth inequality, there'd be more income inequality. You can say that. But there'd also be a lot more employment, a lot more entrepreneurship, and a lot more leadership. I'd rather have more people like Bill Gates and Steve Jobs, the Henry Ford, Alfred P. Sloan of an earlier era. So I don't think the strategy is to tear down people who succeed. The strategy is to make them pay their fair share and to succeed through the work they do and the products they produce, not the system they game, and to give everybody a chance to fulfill their whole potential. That's how I think we ought to address inequality, David.
If you look at Macomb County over the last couple of decades, the number of manufacturing jobs has fallen by about 40%, but the number of people employed has stayed about the same. So clearly, what's happened is the factories have gotten more productive. They've employed technology, employ fewer people, and those people have gone to other jobs. And that's been the history of technology and technological change in the United States since we brought tractors and combines to the farm. But I think there's a widespread fear that somehow we're at a different point here, that the advent of artificial intelligence means that there really will be no job that's untouched, no career that's safe, and that we're at a greater risk of a dystopian novel where there's a few people who have all the money, have all the jobs, own all the robots, own all the computers, write the software, and the rest of us are left to pick up their laundry and take care of their grandparents. So when you look at the AI and the opportunity and threat of AI, what do you say to people who are worried that we're going to do to every job what happened to the factory, but we won't be able to replace those jobs with jobs that pay as much as the old ones?
I think it's the right thing to worry about. But I guess the lesson of what I was saying before is that I think it's the great strength of the United States that by worrying a lot about things, we often can make sure that they didn't happen. Let me be a bit of a wonky professor for just a minute or two and share with you two facts that I found surprising. First, you can look on Google, and Google has an app, I guess it is, where you can see how frequently a phrase was used as a fraction of all the words in all the books and articles in different years. And so I did that the other day with respect to the phrase technological unemployment. I was very surprised by what I found. You found it 10 times as often in the 1960s as you find it today. I'll tell you something else. A colleague of mine did a study. It's more complicated than I'm going to describe. But the essence of it was he looked in every decade and he said, how many people at the beginning of the decade worked in occupations that would shrink by more than a quarter or a third or a half in the next decade? And that's kind of a measure of how much instability there is and how much jobs are being destroyed. You know what the decade was with the least destruction by that measure? The first decade of the 21st century. So we have seen this before. It used to be that, and you can find photographs of when computer wasn't a machine, it was a job. And hundreds of people would be in a room with adding machines doing computations. And all those jobs went away. Used to be, David, when somebody like you sent a letter, that somebody had to type that letter and type that letter with 2 pieces of carbon paper so that there would be 3 copies. And if they typed 3/4 of the letter and then they made a mistake, they started all over again. Well, you know, we don't do that anymore. And because we don't do that anymore, there are many fewer people who are engaged in typing letters than there were then. So I think it's a mistake to underestimate the ingenuity and capacity of a market economy to to put people to work. The AT&T company did a study in the late 70s in which they attempted to estimate if there was a mobile phone that you could carry around, what the demand for them would be. And they concluded that the nationwide demand for them would be 10,000. But that was a better study than the study that was done in the IBM Corporation in the late 1950s, where somebody attempted to estimate the worldwide demand for computers, and their estimate was 5. And so I don't know what the jobs of the future are going to be. I couldn't have imagined 15 years ago that there'd be a huge video game design industry. I couldn't have imagined that there'd be hundreds of thousands of people working as merchants on something called eBay. To take a very different kind of example, not one that's the most pleasant one to think about, but it's one that has made us a softer and gentler and better society. I couldn't have imagined, and no one else could have imagined 15 years ago, the number of people who would be engaged in hospice work. And so I believe that the jobs will come, but I believe something else, even more important, which is they won't come automatically because people sit back and think that the joys and glory of the market will make there be jobs. They'll come because people with imagination and energy and new policies and help from the government made them come. America went from 50% of the people on farms to 4% of the people on farms. That's vastly larger than anything we have ahead of us in manufacturing. In manufacturing right now, about 9% of the workforce is in the manufacturing sector, but of that 9%, 5% are working as assistants or in advertising or in marketing or keeping the books or whatever. So it's only 4% of the people who are in production work. Yes, that number, because of technology, will probably go down. But that's not a change like the change from 50% of the people on the farms. But that change from 50% of the people on the farms to where we are now didn't happen automatically, and it didn't happen beautifully. It happened with the struggles of the labor movement. It happened with the move to the universal availability of high school education. It came with huge efforts to develop the infrastructure that put people to work and knit a country together. It came with the development of a set of social insurance programs, Social Security and unemployment insurance. Huge changes require large responses, but that's not a reason to keep doing it the old way when other parts of the world are moving forward. That's not a reason to wall off the world. That's not a reason for fatalism. It's a reason to get to work, figuring out what the needs and opportunities are, creating the institutions that will meet them, and preparing people to do the necessary work. And that's how America has always responded to change in the past, and I think we can respond that way in the future.
So I like the optimism, and I actually share your faith that we can work it out. But what worries you about missteps? What would make you think that we're not moving in the right direction?
Look, I think our country and our democracy, and indeed the idea of democracy, is being tested right now. And it's being tested by how the American system responds to the leadership it is currently receiving. And if the opposition doesn't think about what its alternative vision is for moving forward, but buckles under, or if the opposition condemns the path we're on without offering constructive alternatives, or if we find a consensus in America that it's all the fault of some other country and the system, or it's all the fault of some minority groups within our country, if that's the conclusion we reach, then we can fail. And I don't think it's going to happen. I pray it's not going to happen. But every leading nation, in history has eventually stopped being a leading nation. And if you look, and I'm not a deep historian, but I've talked to those who are, and I've read, if you look, only very rarely is what happened externally what brought it down. It was what happened internally. And that is the test for this generation of Americans. And I think we're going to meet it. I'm pretty sure that we're going to meet it. But it's not going to happen easily, and it's not going to happen if we each are in it only for ourselves and not for our future.
We're in a part of the country where the auto industry is pretty big, and I want to ask you a couple questions about that. The first one is, you were one of the architects of the auto bailout of the early Obama years, and I'm curious, with the benefit of hindsight, how well it worked, what worked out differently than what you anticipated. Are there things you would do differently, or are you proud of this, or what?
The things that I would have done with the benefit of hindsight, I think might have been done differently and better when I was in government. And there are details about the automobile sector that I would have done differently. But I think the core judgments that animated us were exactly right. What were those core judgments? That the automobile industry was central to a crucial part of our country, and that because we had an extraordinarily deep recession, that was not a reason why, in the name of some free market principle, we could sit back and let it collapse. And so the first decision was that the automobile industry had to be supported. Second decision was that there had to be accountability and adjustment. The share owners who had made a set of bad investments, the government's job was to keep the industry going. It wasn't to keep the people who'd made bad investments going. So the shareholders lost the value of their shares in the companies that went through bankruptcy, General Motors and Chrysler. And the chief executives lost their jobs. And that's also how it should have been. There were many people who told us that the automobile industry couldn't be put through bankruptcy because no one would ever buy a car from a bankrupt automobile company. But if it hadn't been put through bankruptcy, there wouldn't have been the accountability for the shareholders, there wouldn't have been the accountability for the management, and frankly, there might not have been enough painful adjustment to enable the automobile industry to prosper and succeed going forward. So I think the core decision provides support to keep the industry going, expect and insist on accountability and adjustment were the right ones. And I'm just glad that President Obama had the courage at a moment when the vast majority of the public that didn't live in this part of the country would have gone in the opposite direction, that he had the courage to commit significant government funds to the automobile industry. And the vast majority of those funds have flowed back to the government. And if we hadn't done it, the unemployment insurance bills, the pension guarantee bills, the health care bills would have been vastly greater than the cost that the government paid. So I think it was the right thing to do, and I feel very proud to have played a part in it. And I think enough time has passed that you can say now that we did the right thing in giving all of those workers, all of those engaged as suppliers, giving those iconic American institutions the opportunity that we did. Now, opportunities like that, support programs like that, don't come once a decade. They may not even come once a generation. And so what I think is incumbent on this region is to make sure that it doesn't make the mistakes of the past in being too complacent and too confident and too unwilling to innovate and compete. My guess is that between electric cars and autonomous vehicles, we are heading for the 2 decades of the greatest change in our mobility system since Henry Ford. And I think it's the responsibility of, if I might, institutions like Macomb. It's the responsibility of those in major roles in our major automobile companies. It's the responsibility of every higher education institution in the state of Michigan and most in this region to make sure that this region remains the center of America's mobility system. At a moment when you're going to be challenged from more parts of the world, when you're going to be challenged from Silicon Valley. And that's going to require thinking in unconventional ways. That's going to require drawing people in who aren't the kind of people who've always been drawn in the past. But I don't see any reason why a period of extraordinary change in automobiles can't be a period of extraordinary opportunity.
How would you rate the relative advantages of the Detroit region and Silicon Valley for having the brains of the autonomous vehicle, AI, electric cars?
Look, I don't think it's that hard at one level to answer the question. In terms of the capacity to connect wheels to engines with a structure that attracts people, all the expertise is here. In terms of the capacity for development of that which depends on chips and the programming of chips, that expertise historically has not been here, and historically has been in Silicon Valley. And the question, as those kinds of expertise are brought together, is going to be who levers whom and who provides the drive and entrepreneurship that ultimately brings everything together. And does the United States figure out how to do that, or does it somehow happen first somewhere else? And a lot of that's going to have to do with who decides to embrace the new and who decides to hold on to the old. Who decides to try to make a lot of rules that preserve the demand for what exists, and who decides to emphasize creating the future. And those choices are in all of our hands. And I hope that this region and that this country makes them wisely.
Talking about the auto bailout reminds me that it was 10 years ago this month that Bear Stearns failed, got the Federal Reserve subsidized the purchase of Bear Stearns by JP Morgan, and we had no clue, or at least I certainly didn't, how wrenching the financial crisis would be that followed. I think because the recovery took so long, and because the stock market has been so strong, and because some of the bankers seem to be back at full strength and certainly full compensation, there's kind of a sense that somehow the banks got bailed out more than Main Street did, despite what you said about the auto bailout. So when you talk to people about that and reflect upon that period of our history, how do you answer them? And you often hear, and none of the bankers went to jail, is always part of that thing.
It's a great question, and when I think about my government service sometimes before I fall asleep at night and sort of review what could have been, it's probably the question I ask myself most frequently. I think there's some parts of what the critics say that are kind of unfair. You know, people talk about it as a big bailout, but the truth is that the government made a profit on the deal. And more money came back than the government put in, and so taxpayers actually made a profit. And the truth is that if we hadn't done it, we might have seen the Great Depression again. That if you look at the way the economic statistics were unfolding in 2008, it matches 1929 pretty well. And that it turned around because we took measures that gave a lot of confidence. And it's easy to say now, we didn't need to worry so much about confidence, but who knows what would have happened if we hadn't worried so much about confidence. And if you've got a bank run going, I mean, think about a bank run. And then think about what happens if the government says, you know, the guy who ran the bank is evil and we're going to put him in jail. It might be fair, but it's not going to stop the bank run. And the bank run's going to have some pretty catastrophic consequences. So I think there's a certain amount of exaggeration in what the critics say. On the other hand, could the board of directors who presided over those companies' excess risk-taking that drove the economy to the brink of ruin, should they have been allowed to resign quietly? Or should they have seen themselves as failures who made a lot of money while letting down America on the evening news? I kind of think that they probably should have been a lot more naming and a lot more shaming than there was. Should there have been prosecutions? It's very hard to know. I find it hard to believe that there wasn't more criminal wrongdoing than has been identified. On the other hand, stupidity isn't a crime. And some of those people who ran those banks so badly had virtually all their money invested in those banks and were completely wiped out. So they were terrible, but I'm not sure they were evil or criminal. So I don't know the answer to that question, but I do share the sense and worry that there wasn't enough accountability for those who had made serious errors. But I'd ask you to have a little bit of sympathy for the people who are making the decisions. You know, in a just war, there are sometimes unintended victims and casualties. And when you're trying to stop a system from collapsing, there are probably going to be some beneficiaries who really don't morally deserve to be beneficiaries. But just as if you say no unfair casualties, you sometimes can't do what's necessary, I'd ask you, while being critical, to have a little bit of sympathy for decision makers who really in the moment thought that the American financial system might collapse and that we might have the Great Depression all over again if they took some risks on the side of having unfair beneficiaries. But look, you've asked what I think is the hardest question for me, and the one where I'm most uncertain as I think about my time in government. I'd just say one other thing. A part of this question, a part of what makes people angry, is that there's a sense that somehow Wall Street got bailed out and Main Street didn't. And there's a lot to that. But there, I would give President Obama and his team a little more credit. They were trying to do a lot more for Main Street. And once we got past the moment of the first emergency, whether it was investing in rebuilding the infrastructure, or giving aid to distressed communities, or extending unemployment insurance benefits, they really did have a very, very difficult time with the Congress that was in place. And President Obama was trying to do a lot more for Main Street than he was able to get done.
And do you think we've done enough, Dodd-Frank, you mentioned regulatory changes, to protect us from another crisis like the one we just had?
I think we've done a lot. I don't think we've done enough. I think I'm still not confident that if things turn down, we will recognize it quickly enough and impose enough pain on the banking system early to prevent the crisis from metastasizing. The big mistakes, in my view, in 2008 were not the TARP and providing support to the big financial institutions. I think if you go through the history, you can quibble with various aspects of how it was done, but I think it would have been very hard for anyone responsible not to have bailed out the system in some way. The big mistakes were that there was a whole phony war period from the time Bear Stearns fell in March till the time the crisis exploded in September and October, when the banks could have been made to fortify themselves. They could have been told and forced to not keep paying money out to their shareholders that then they weren't going to have to provide confidence. And that wasn't done. And I'm not 100% certain that we have a system, because of a variety of accounting details and technicalities of how it works. I'm not confident that we have a system that will get it right the next time. You know, we have this exercise that the Fed talks about every year called the stress tests. And they say, every year they say, some version of the same thing. They say they've tested all the banks and if the unemployment rate went to 12%, and if the Dow Jones average went from 25,000 to 11,000, and if house prices fell 50% more than they did in 2008, all the banks would be fine. I don't believe it. I don't know that you necessarily have to have your house prepared against a 500-year flood, and I don't know that we necessarily need to have a banking system that is safe for something far worse than happened in 2008. But the fact that we keep claiming that we do makes me a little nervous about how well we've got this under control.
All that faith you have just doesn't apply here.
Trust but verify, and I hope we'll never have the experiment that gives an opportunity to verify.
So we got about 3 minutes left, so I want to give you a chance to answer a question that you wish I'd asked but didn't.
What would you like to? Okay, so the question is, what would you like to say to the young people who are studying here at Macomb, and what do you wish you'd done differently when you were young? And I guess that'd be the question.
Good question.
And I guess my answer would be, find yourself something where you can be the best in your world that you like, and work at making yourself even better at it. Work at it by learning from who's ever older, who you think is best. Work at it by finding the best team of friends and peers you can work with. And work at it with people who are following you. I've always found that the best way to learn a subject is to teach it. And you understand it much better when you do. And if you find something where you're the expert, the world will find its way to you because it'll value your expertise and your special skill. And that'll be enormously satisfying in your career. Whether it's the ability to fix a certain kind of machinery, or the ability to design a certain kind of workroom, or the ability to give a certain category of people the help and the assistance they require. But we are living in an age where there's going to be much more specialization than there ever has been before. And so figure out what you want to have be special about you and go and run with it. And with all the problems, with all the doubts, with all the questions, your generation is going to be the generation where a large, substantial fraction of it is going to live to 100. Your generation is going to be a generation that's going to see and absorb much more of the world than most of the people in my generation did. And I think your generation, like generations before it, is going to meet its obligation to history and renew what I think is the greatest country in the history of the world. And as my generation fades a bit, I envy you that opportunity.
Thank you very much.